Hi, I'm Ernest Hoving, Extension Veterinarian here at Penn State University, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about bedding. Bedding is very important for cow comfort, but it also plays a very important role in the mastitis and udder health status of your herd. There's lots of different types of bedding, and we'd like to look at a couple of them to talk about some of the things that we should consider when we're looking at ways to minimize the risk of ending up with mastitis in your herd. Bedding obviously provides a surface for the cow to lie down on, and as such it needs to provide a good level of comfort. However, it also is in direct contact with the udder, and therefore it's important that we maintain a good quality of bedding so as to reduce the risk of mastitis. What we like to say is that it's important to know who your cows are in bed with. We'd like to spend a few minutes looking at how we can evaluate the quality of the bedding that you have in your stalls. The sand, when it's new or fresh, does not have a significant amount of organic material in it, which is great for reducing the levels of bacterial growth. However, as sand remains in the stalls for a longer period of time, it starts to build up organic matter, and so we need to regularly replace the sand in the stalls to remove that organic matter. If we're using recycled sand, we also need to be aware of the amount of organic matter that's building up in the sand. Manure solids are another option that a lot of farms are selecting as a bedding choice these days. Manure solids can provide excellent cushioning. They're very soft. Manure solids are also very plentiful, and so they tend to be fairly economical. However, there are some challenges with using manure solids for bedding, and those include that they retain moisture quite easily, so they need to be changed frequently in order to keep them dry. Manure solids also have a lot of nutrients in them which support bacterial growth, and so that is a real challenge. The bacterial numbers can very quickly increase in the bedding when they're in the stall for any significant length of time. The moisture content of manure solids is certainly a concern. After manure solids have been put through the separation process, we need to make sure we dry them out as much as possible. And then we also need to make sure once they're in the stall that they are changed frequently so that they remain dry. One of the ways we can quickly check the moisture level of manure solids is to do a squeeze test. If we put some manure solids in our hand and firmly squeeze them, they should not really retain their shape after we stop squeezing them. They should fall apart and crumble like that if they're dry enough. However, as you can see from this sample, it tends to be retaining its shape quite well, and so the moisture content in this bedding is likely higher than we would like to see it. So manure solids contain a lot of nutrients that will support bacterial growth. There's a couple of different ways that solids can be used. They can be used green, which means that they are separated from the liquid phase of the manure and then returned immediately to the beds. They can be composted, which means that we put them, store them for a certain period of time to allow the temperature to increase, and we might go through a turning process with that as well. Or they might be put through a digester in which we actually capture some of the gases and use those for energy purposes. So these are green manure solids. As you can see, they're coming directly out of the separator, and then we end up with a pile of green manure solids. So what we have here is essentially manure with the moisture removed. There's still a lot of bacteria in here. There's still a lot of nutrients that will support bacterial growth. You also know that if we add liquid back in with this, we end up with manure again. So this is manure solids that have been going through a compost cycle. They feel very nice and warm. You can see that they're steaming here because of the heat that's being generated. But the problem is, if we don't heat them up far enough, we might actually be encouraging bacterial growth rather than stopping it. So it's important that we reach an adequate temperature to kill the bacteria and in order to produce a high quality bedding. The problem is if we raise the temperature, we might actually be encouraging bacterial growth, and a lot of those bacteria might be ones that are responsible for environmental mastitis. So our coliforms, our streptococci, and others might actually be increasing in numbers if we compost this material, but don't do it properly.
I'm Hannah Lysick, a research technician here at Penn State. I'm going to show you how we can evaluate the different types and quantity of bacteria found in bedding samples. First, we'll weigh out a specific amount of bedding and put it into a tube. These tubes will be left on the counter at room temperature, and these tubes will be put into the incubator at 37 degrees Celsius. I'll add a little bit of water to one of the room temperature tubes and one of the 37 degrees Celsius tubes, so that we'll have a dry and a wet sample at room temperature and a dry and a wet sample at 37. The samples that I'm incubating are mimicking a cow laying down on the bedding and heating it up and warming it to body temperature for a while. Every few hours, a 1 gram sample is taken from each tube, and then it's plated onto agar. We can use different types of agar to look at the different kinds of bacteria. We can use this plate count agar to look at almost any kind of bacteria, or a more specific type of agar like this McConkey's agar to look more specifically at gram-negative bacteria. Coliforms like E. coli and Klebsiella will be found on this gram-negative McConkey plate, whereas gram-positives like Staphylococcus and Streptococcus would show up on this plate count agar. So these results are showing us about the levels of bacteria in the bedding over time. You can see that as time goes on, the number of bacteria increases in both the dry and wet samples at room temperature and warmed. The samples that were warmed grew so many bacteria at the end that it was uncountable, and you would have to dilute this down in order to get a good count. Now imagine if a teat end is laying right on there. That's a lot of bacteria. Samples that were dry grew less bacteria than samples that were wet, especially after 24 hours. It takes moisture and heat to grow bacteria, so when you warm and wet samples, you're much more likely to get more bacteria, and we can see that reflected in these plates. So keeping bedding dry can definitely help in reducing the amount of bacteria that you have growing in the bedding.
As you can see, a cow's udder spends a lot of time in direct contact with the bedding throughout the day. We want our cows to spend a lot of time lying down in the beds, reclining and relaxing, but it's very important that we don't expose the teat ends, and the udder to excessive amounts of bacteria. If our bedding is not clean and dry, we run the risk that we have high bacterial numbers on the teats and the teat ends at milking time and between milking times, and that increases the risk for mastitis. No matter how good your procedures might be in the parlor, we run the risk of having bacteria there that can cause mastitis. So it's important that you do all that you can to have a clean, dry, comfortable surface with low bacteria numbers for your cows to recline on throughout the day. This is Ernest Hoving from Penn State Extension asking you, who are your cows in bed with?